Hey there, and welcome to the Ditch That Textbook Digital Summit, where we are all about those great teaching ideas and technology and creativity and innovation, all of that fun stuff that you want to use in your classroom, practical ideas that you can use in class tomorrow. My name's Matt Miller. I'm the host of the summit, author of Ditch That Textbook, and I am super excited for you to get to meet today's guests on this video because they have some ideas that I know that you can plug into class right away without extra time and effort. Probably some things that you're already doing that you can kind of adapt and change and implement into your teaching. Really good stuff here. They've written a great book that we're going to talk about too. I need to kind of quit gushing about them and just let them themselves. So in this video, we're going to be talking to Patrice Bain and Pooja Agarwal, who are the authors of this fantastic book that I like an awful lot called Powerful Teaching. And we're going to get into this and some of the things that are inside of it. Whether you buy the book or not, you're going to learn some of the things that are inside during this video. So I need to turn it over to them so they can tell you a little bit about themselves. So let's start with Patrice. Patrice, can you tell, first of all, thank you for being on this video. Secondly, can you tell everybody a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Well, hi, Matt. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having us on. I am a veteran K-12 teacher with over 25 years teaching at a middle school level. And I was so lucky to have authentic research start in my classroom with Pooja Agarwal. And together our collaboration has lasted many years, and now we're co-authors. Take it away, Pooja.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having us, Matt. It was so much fun to be a part of the Ditch Summit, I think a few years ago, 2 years ago, and I'm so thrilled that Patrice and I are back. Again, my name is Dr. Pooja Agarwal. I have been doing research on how students learn for about 15 years. So I am a cognitive scientist. I am also a teacher. I taught all 80 of my students today, and I currently teach about 80 college students. I teach psychology and neuroscience at the Berklee College of Music in Boston. So I actually teach science at a music school, which I love. But as you know, with my cognitive scientist hat, Patrice and I started doing research in her classroom 15 years ago in collaboration with the authors of Make It Stick. So Roddy Roediger was my PhD mentor, Mark McDaniel, and Kathleen McDermott when I was at Washington University in St. Louis. So our research together in Patrice's class is featured in Make It Stick, and we are so excited to take that research, put it into powerful teaching, and make a lot of that more practical, like you said, little tips that you can do in your classroom without grading, no prep, no textbook, none of that stuff.
Excellent. You're speaking my language there. Absolutely. And I'm so glad that you mentioned Make It Stick too, because I read Make It Stick a few years ago and I kept thinking, you know, there's some stuff related to education, but then there's some stuff related to business and to all other things. And I kept thinking, oh my goodness, this is stuff that we need to get into the hands of teachers. And basically that's what happened here. That's what Pooja and Patrice have both done, you know, taking the cognitive science hat and the K-12 teacher hat and, you know, putting all of that practice all together. And I think the thing that I love about this so much is that it is totally based on research and cognitive science, which I know to some of us out in the education world, we hear all of that stuff and we're like, think about that. I don't want to go through research, but you know what the great thing is that these guys like to do that. And they took all of that together and they put it into a book where we can take all of those findings and start plugging them into our classrooms in meaningful, practical ways. It's like, it makes me think back to in my own class, you know, I would go and I would try things. And this is to me, and I want to hear your take on this, Pooja and Patrice. To me, this is why this book is so useful. It's because for me, you know, I would teach and I would try things that I thought sounded good, that sounded like they would work, that sounded like they made sense. And I would go try them. And then later on, I'd be like, I might as well have just not even taught that day because it just didn't work. You know, something didn't stick, something didn't sink in, something didn't connect. and it just wasn't working. But then other things we would do, kids would come back, you know, weeks or months or even years later, and they'd still remember it. And I thought, my goodness, there is some sort of missing connection here. And I feel like that's so much of what you guys were trying to do. So I wanted to throw that over to you. Is that kind of the purpose of powerful teaching? And, you know, maybe you can like phrase it in your own words, like, it, you know, kind of what's your take on that?
Yeah, I think part of that, like you said, is being able to wade through all the research is intimidating. I think part of that is it's inaccessible, right? In a literal sense, research is behind paywalls. In a figurative, literal sense, it's full of jargon. And so something that Patrice and I have always loved is sort of turning that research into English and making sense of it, and then turning that English into practice, right? So we don't just translate the research, but we translate it into practice. And I think that's what's really unique about our collaboration together for 15 years is we've been bouncing ideas off of each other and doing research together and talking about, as both of us as teachers as well, what this looks like in our classroom.
Yeah, yeah. And Patrice, could you tell us just a little bit about the moment when you started to realize how powerful all of this was in your own classroom?
Oh my. Well, actually, it started, I think, when I approached my administration about getting this grant and this research into my classroom to start with. And I remember my superintendent specifically asking me, why would you want this grant? Why do you want this? And I said, because I know many of my students learn and I don't know why. And so it was thrilling to be working with Dr. Roediger and Dr. McDaniel, but having Pooja with me every day where we could look at research, where we could tweak what we were doing, where we were really able to understand the whys of how students learn, and then taking that and creating various strategies based on that research that we know work. And so, was there a particular moment? I think just with the start, and then as we did it every day, being able to look into my students' eyes and seeing they were learning.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So if you're watching this and you're going, okay, this sounds great, this is the kind of stuff I want to know about, I want you to get your note taking out, you know, whatever it is, notebook, you know, tablet, Google Docs, whatever. I want you to get it out. P.S. There are PDF notes that you can download from this session on the Ditch Summit website. So you can do that, but go ahead and get that out because we're going to start sharing a bunch of that practical stuff. If you've ever wondered, like, A, how do their brains work? B, how can I use that to my advantage to help them to learn? That's basically what we're about to dig into. And the thing I love about their work in this book is that it's all kind of focused around what they call these 4 power tools. And so Pooja, maybe I can kick this one over to you. Can you give us a very brief, because we're going to touch on as many of these power tools as we can. And it's funny because whenever I talk about tools, because, you know, I'm big into the technology thing, I'm thinking like tech tools, like, oh, we're going to talk about Google Docs. Oh, we're going to talk about Flipgrid, or we're going to talk about something like that. That's not necessarily what we're talking about here, is it?
I think actually it kind of is, right? So I think tools can be used as power tools. And power tools can be very effective with tech tools. So I'm glad you mentioned Flipgrid. I use Flipgrid almost every day, definitely once a week with my college students. I heard about Flipgrid because of the Ditch Summit 2 years ago.
Yeah.
So I've started using it, and it's a way actually that I use for all of our power tools, but the first one is called Retrieval, or Retrieval Practice. The simple idea, it's intuitive, we all do it as teachers, is for us to focus on pulling information out of students' heads instead of trying to cram it in. And so when I talk with my music students, for instance, they have to practice their instruments. They can't just watch someone, they can't just listen to someone. They learn their instruments when they practice. And so in my classroom and in all this research we've done, and it goes back 100 years, you have to practice an instrument and you have to practice your knowledge. You can't just get stuff into students' heads. What helps them retain, what helps long-term learning, what helps all of our lessons stick, is pulling that information out. So Flipgrid is a nice example where I just post a discussion question and then students share their responses. And it's not even necessarily that it's completely retrieval emphasized. It's part of kind of the classroom culture that Patrice and I can talk about. But Flipgrid is a way for students to just pull out what they know. So if I ask students, how does this concept about the modality effect, something I talked about in class today, how does the modality effect apply to how you learn your instrument from sight reading versus listening? And then they're just retrieving and making those connections instead of me saying, all right, class, here's the modality effect, and here's why it's important, and here's how it relates to everyday life. So the first power tool is that retrieval practice, and Kahoot, Quizlet, Flipgrid, those are all strategies for retrieval practice.
All right, very good. So that's the first one. We've got retrieval practice. Let's go ahead and just go down through the four of them, if you can quickly summarize them. So the four power tools. The first one is retrieval practice. What else have we got?
Well, and actually, I want to mention that I encourage everyone who's watching to not take out their notes. Don't write things down. We'll give you the opportunity to retrieve. I hope at maybe the end of this video, Matt, if you'll give me and Patrice like 2 minutes, we'll talk about more effective note taking. So just don't take notes. Okay, so the first one is retrieval practice. The second one is called spacing. Again, the research goes back 100 years. We do it already as teachers. In Powerful Teaching, we talk about how to do it more intentionally. So the simple idea of spacing is actually that forgetting is necessary for learning. So often we might ask students, you know, what did you remember in class today? Or what did you learn in class today? Spacing is simply asking, what did you learn in class yesterday? That's it. It's giving students a little bit of a mental struggle, letting that time pass, spacing it out so that they are learning more when they forget. It's almost like when you're learning a language and then you forget it for a while and then you go back to using it again, it kind of comes back more quickly. That's a key component of spacing, is just spacing it out instead of, for instance, instead of students cramming, you know, for pulling an all-nighter before an exam, they cram, and then Matt and Patrice, they do well on the exam, and then what happens in our classrooms?
It's gone.
It's gone, right? They forget everything because they've crammed. When students space things out over time, when we as teachers space things out over time, it improves long-term learning. So cramming improves short-term learning, but spacing improves long-term learning. That's the second power tool, spacing.
Excellent. Okay, so retrieval practice is 1, spacing is 2. What else have we got?
The third power tool is called interleaving. This one is a little more nitty-gritty. The gist of interleaving is to mix things up. So one example I give about math is instead of having students do 10 addition problems, 10 subtraction, 10 multiplication, is to mix them up. So now students can't just plug and chug. It's not like, all right, these are addition, these are subtraction, now moving on. If you mix them up, then students have to really think, what strategy do I apply here? Another example of interleaving that the authors of Make It Stick mentioned is an example of a batter and a pitcher. So let's say it's batting practice and the pitcher is throwing pitches. And if the batter knows that they're going to get 10 fastballs, 10 curveballs, and 10 changeups or slow pitches, the pitcher, well, the batter literally knows what's coming at them. They know these 10 pitches are fastballs, these 10 are curveballs, these 10 are changeups. And if you interleave them, then a batter doesn't know what's coming at them. They have to be prepared to figure it out, to retrieve, to know what's going to happen. So with interleaving, another simple example is with flashcards, instead of going through a deck start to finish, is to have students shuffle it up so that everything's mixed up. And with tech tools, I actually have a rundown on my website, retrievalpractice.org, of different tech tools that do these power tools really well. So which tech tools allow for shuffling helps with interleaving. One tech tool has the reminder feature, which helps with spacing. They all help with retrieval. So the third one is interleaving, mixing it up. Patrice has a really, really good example. So Patrice, can you give that example of interleaving real quick?
And which one are you talking about, Pooja?
How you interleave the Russian and French revolutions.
Okay, because I do have several that I could have brought up. So I taught history, world history, and I would teach the students about the French Revolution. Well, later, we would talk about the Russian Revolution, where a period of time, places, characters, everything changes, right? But when when I was teaching my students, I could talk to them while we're talking about the Russian Revolution and bring up space about the French Revolution, compare, contrast. And so when I'm talking then about the revolutions, the students are able to go back to the French, to go back to the Russian, and to discriminate, to compare, contrast, and pull out those differences. So again, it works in math, it works in coaching, but it works in science, it works in history, it works in all subjects.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Okay, so we've got retrieval practices number 1, spacing is 2, interleaving is 3. So now we've got oh, and by the way, you mentioned interleaving. You said that some we keep tying this back to technology. Some tech tools do this better than others. One of the things, whenever I talk about Quizlet, because Quizlet does online flashcards, one of the things I like to touch on from this idea is I tell them that there is a button that you can click on Quizlet that increases students' learning. And all you have to do is just click that one button and students will learn more. How often in education can you say that? You click this one button and students are guaranteed, I don't want to say guaranteed, but I can almost say guaranteed.
Well, based on research.
Yeah. Based on research, exactly. And of course that button is the shuffle button because of interleaving. So anyway, it's hard for me to get not talk about the tech tools because that's kind of what I do. But anyway, that's one of my favorite things to talk about related to that.
Yeah,
it's easy. So okay, so those are the 3 we've got so far: retrieval practice, spacing, interleaving. What's number 4?
Number 4 is what we call feedback-driven metacognition. So the 2 key components, feedback and metacognition, they go together. Again, feedback we use as teachers. We give students feedback. We tell them how they're doing. It's a key component of formative assessment, right? We get feedback. A big difference is that with retrieval practice, it's like students get formative feedback for themselves, right? So when they're engaging in Quizlet or Kahoot, then students know how they're doing. And so often students don't have that opportunity. One example, one big problem is if, let's say, the first time students retrieve is on an exam, they don't know what they've learned, and there's like that shock figure. I studied for 8 hours straight and I bombed the test, and what happened? And with feedback, students have to retrieve, and that can be short quizzes, that can be tech tools. We can talk more about some strategies if you like, and then they have to have feedback, and that doesn't mean grading at all.
Right.
We emphasize in Powerful Teaching that none of this has to be graded. All of these are learning strategies, not assessment strategies. So the feedback can be think, pair, share. It can be feedback from the tech tools. It can be a quick class discussion. And what that feedback does is it helps students with their metacognition. So, something so meta. It's the cognition of your cognition. It's thinking about your own thinking about your own learning. So for me, I have written retrieval practices every week. They're like short answer questions. They're only worth 2% of students' grades. And next to each question, I have little check boxes. And as students are answering these short answer questions, they just check box. Did I nail it or am I not sure? And it's a way for them to reflect on not just did I get it right or wrong, but how am I feeling? How confident am I? And I tell them what they checkbox has nothing to do with their grades, but it's like a future note to yourself so that when I hand them back, they can see, oh, I thought I wasn't sure, but I actually did get it correct. Or I thought I nailed it, but something there was wrong. And so the feedback is important. It ties into the metacognition. There's a lot of research demonstrating that when your metacognition improves, your retrieval improves, and your long-term learning improves. So it's a big component of this whole process of learning that we do, but we can do it a little more intentionally with little checkboxes, stamps I put on the written quizzes. Again, class discussions doesn't have to be graded feedback at all.
Yeah. There's so much of that I absolutely love. I loved the little check boxes, you know, because that's, like you said, it's not for you as the teacher, it's for the students. So it's like, hey, no judgment. I'm not passing judgment. I'm not harming your grade if you put not sure about this. But it's like, did I nail it or am I not sure about it? So that when they go back, you know, now they've got that as an aid to be able to think back through things. And just this, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
For younger grades, it could be a smiley face, sad face, right?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, my college students can checkbox it. And actually, their most recent retrieval practice this week, I forgot to include the checkboxes. And so a number of them like wrote in, nailed it,
wow.
or not sure, because it's part of what they do now in my class. And it's just part of the routine, part of the culture. So it's fun and you can adapt it for younger grades too.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we've got the retrieval, which, like you said, is where we practice by pulling information out of our brains instead of trying to cram it in. We've got the spacing, which is all about, you know, forgetting as part of learning. And if we can space it out and not try to cram it all at once. We've got the interleaving, where mixing it up and throwing things out in a different order is better than the same groups and then moving on to the next group and moving on to the next group. And then you've got the feedback-driven metacognition. And I hear the two things in there. You've got the feedback, which is important to help kids understand how they did, and then the metacognition, thinking about what's working for you. How does this, you know, how is all of this going? So I love all of these power tools. And what I love about the work that the two of you have done is that we're not just going to talk about these 4 power tools in theory and, you know, generalities. We can talk about some specific strategies that you can actually use in the classroom. And one of the things that I love about these is that A, they seem so easy to do, and B, they don't take a lot of prep time, if any prep time, most of the time. And I think sometimes, I know even for me, I'll look at some of them and I'll be like, well, that's easy. Or I might even say, well, that's obvious. To which you might reply, yeah, so why aren't you doing it? You know, or maybe this is a little different way than you can do it. And so I want to get into some of those how do I do it type of things. So Patrice, I'm going to pass this one over to you, and I'm going to give you kind of carte blanche on the 4 power tools. And maybe you can tell us the way that some of the strategies, some of the ways that you've used any of these 4 power tools in your own classroom, what that might look like so that we can replicate it in our own classrooms.
Oh, I'd be delighted to do that. First of all, before I start talking about these, when you go to our site at powerfulteaching.org and go to resources, you can download all the templates that we're going to be talking about. So don't get nervous that, you know, you have to try to remember them. They're all there for you.
And I'll mention real quick, we'll also link that up on the Ditch Summit website. So if you're on the speaker page right now with the video, just scroll down a little bit, and we'll also stick those into the PDF notes. So you got lots of places where you can get that link to go to those templates.
Okay, great. So something that started out when Pooja and I were first working together, we were looking at retrieval, and we did a pop final the first year. And what really struck me was that my top GPA student, who normally did, 100% on everything, only scored in about the 50th percentile in this pop final. It didn't go in the grade book, so it was okay for the kids. But I started to look at homework, and I realized that my students had really mastered homework. They knew how to look at a question, look up the answer, write it down, and repeat. And there was no retrieval going on. They had mastered simply writing down information. And a day later, a week later, we weren't able to get to critical thinking. And so I quit giving homework. And instead, I started devising strategies based on these power tools. such as I gave mini quizzes every day. And simple, I took little pieces, 2 by 3 inch pieces of paper, and whatever homework would have been or what we had discussed in class, I would simply cut up little strips of paper and put them in a basket. And we would start every class where I would just randomly pick out 5. Now, it sounds so easy, but I no longer graded 2.5 hours of homework every night.
Yeah.
I know, right?
Yeah.
And
huge.
instead, I had this 15-minute analysis after school where I could see how the students did. By this simple technique, the students were retrieving. They were also getting immediate feedback because we would go over the answers. I would do the analysis after school. I would hand them back the following day, go over them again. So now we also had spacing. And so rather than having the students just copying down information, they were now retrieving, and they were able to test what they knew versus what they didn't. And that simple tweak made so much difference. I noticed that students started listening differently in class because they knew what we discussed could be on a mini quiz later. And they really started listening with more purpose.
Mm-hmm.
So that is something so simple to use that's going to be very effective.
So I'm sorry. So that one, just to recap real quick, that one is the idea of the mini quiz. And can you give us like the little tiny nutshell what that is one more time?
Simply take information that would have been in homework or would have been discussed in class, cut it up into little clues, and just randomly pick 5, 10. And, these don't have to be graded because retrieval is a learning strategy, not an assessment strategy.
Mm-hmm.
And so as you teach students how to learn, which to me is so valuable, that they start to understand. In fact, you have the shared language with retrieval, with metacognition. And so that's one way, mini quizzes. I highly recommend those.
I love that one. That's great. That's great. Very good. Do you have another one that you want to share?
Yes. Another one, I realized flashcards. How often do we assign flashcards? And flashcards were just like homework, where they would simply look in the back of the book or wherever, write down an answer, and they weren't retrieving. So I switched up and I no longer gave flashcards. I call them retrieval cards. And what they would do is, without the use of books, without anything in front of them, the first thing they had to do was try to figure out if they could answer it or not. I came up with what I called the 4 steps of metacognition. Let me talk about them real quick. The first one is you make a judgment of learning. Do you know it or not? And I would have the students write, just put a star or a question mark, kind of like Pooja's little boxes. And the second step, answer all those that you starred, that you knew. The third step is where you, for the first time, open up your book or your notes. You look up those that you don't know. And the fourth step is to verify. So with my retrieval cards, they would get a sheet. I would have the definition on there. These were 6th graders. It was history. I wanted us all on the same page as far as the definition. And the first step, they would go through, do they know it or not? Second, they would answer those that they knew. Then they would look up the answers. And then finally, they would verify. And the beauty of this is not only were they using retrieval, they were using metacognition, but they also had a study tool that had a judgment of learning. So they knew what to study, what they didn't know, what they needed to focus upon. So mini quizzes and retrieval cards.
I love that. That's great. I wanted to I had to quickly jot this down real fast. The 4 steps of metacognition. You said it's a judgment of learning. Do you know it or don't you know it?
Mhm.
And then if you do know it, answer it.
Answer.
If you don't know it, look it up. And then once you've looked it up, verify that it's accurate.
Yeah.
Awesome. I love that. That's great. And could you touch on one more time how that linked back into the retrieve cards?
The students, in order to complete the retrieval cards, use the 4 steps. So
I see.
instead of flashcards where they looked up an answer, that first step was, do they know it or not?
Okay. Gotcha.
And then going through the 4 steps.
Okay. Excellent. All right. So we've got mini quizzes. We've got retrieval cards. We've already got a couple of things here. And again, remember we said earlier, these are the kinds of things that sound like, oh my goodness, this sounds like it's easy or too easy to be true or too good to be true or something. And these are like the little things. Patrice, I think you used the word tweaks. It was like a little tweak that you made, and all of a sudden, boom, now you've got something that, something that's more effective only because we made that one little adjustment. And that's all we're really trying to do. And thank goodness for so many of us in education who feel like our plates are so full of things and we don't have time for yet another thing. This is the stuff that helps learning be more effective, teaching be more effective, and we don't have to add more time to do it.
And Matt, they're not based on anecdotes or fads. I mean, this is all evidence research based.
Yep. Absolutely.
And I'll also add, Matt, you had mentioned like all the free resources. We've got stuff like here's the little figure of all 4 steps of metacognition. In our
there it is.
Yeah, there it is. Let's see, page 140. But you can also download that figure at powerfulteaching.org and at retrievalpractice.org. So we've even got the figures from the book that you can download to help you out.
Excellent. Very good. Very good. Okay. So Pooja, now it's time for me to switch it over to you. There's one in particular that I've read about recently. Actually, I didn't tell them this before we got on. I just recorded a new podcast episode of my Ditch That Textbook podcast, which has been out of commission for a long time, and I'm kind of bringing it back to life, where I just talked about this one particular strategy for about 5 minutes on this episode. So I'd love for you to talk about this one at some point, or if there's something else you're also passionate about, we can throw that in too. But the one I'm talking about is the retrieval guides instead of study guides. Is that the one that, I think that's the one. Yeah, I see a big smile on your face. So I assume you know A, what I'm talking about, and B, hopefully that means I picked a good one. Can you tell us about those?
Yeah, I was trying to guess what it was you were thinking of, what you were retrieving. I thought you were going to talk about brain dumps since
I love that one too. Yeah.
I'll mention brain dumps, and then Patrice can maybe mention the retrieval guides.
Sure.
That's part of her classroom.
Okay.
But just the retrieval guides, I'll spoil it, Patrice. But you can explain it more. Is instead of study guides, is to have students retrieve. But brain dumps, Matt and we had talked about how it's a form of retrieval to just ask students to write down everything they know, and that's it. It doesn't have to be graded. Students might be a little hesitant at first, you want me to do what? But then they start enjoying seeing how much they can remember. No prep, no grading. So I think we have like a 1-minute version on YouTube about brain dumps. Another thing we talk about in Powerful Teaching is just what we call 2 things. So instead of asking, write down everything you know, is to just write down what are 2 things you remember from today? What are 2 things you remember from last week? When it comes to learning about sleep and REM cycles, what are 2 things that are maybe still muddy, or 2 things that you remember? So it can be a brain dump that's more general. It could be 2 things about anything, any subject area, any age group as well. So Patrice can mention retrieval guides real quick.
All right, go for it, Patrice.
I found that I had been using study guides. And with those, I might be talking, or we would be reading out of a book, and students were busily trying to write down while I was talking or while we were reading. And that never worked for me. And so I wanted to come up with a better way. And again, I didn't want students copying, I wanted them to retrieve. And so I switched from study guides to retrieval guides. And depending on the age of your student, how guided you want to make them. But for any age, the whole purpose is you simply stop talking, you stop lecturing, you stop reading, you pause, and you let the students retrieve or write down. So depending on the age, I know for my 6th graders, I would have, for example, I think we have this in the book, when we were talking about Africa, we might be talking about Africa, and then the questions on the paper might be, what was the capital? What did the king's court look like? Go ahead and draw this. But the students did not have the information in front of them. They had to retrieve. Now, with older classes, older students, what you can do is create an outline form, but leave the top of the outline blank. So as you are lecturing, when you stop, say, okay, what we just said about the Middle Ages, write down 4 things we just discussed. So it's really the premise behind the retrieval guides is allowing the students the time to pause and retrieve. And by the time class is finished, they have this organized set of information that didn't happen before. Again, it's just a simple tweak, and you change learning.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, love that. With some, and that's really so much of what I see, in these strategies that we're talking about, is that they're just simple little adjustments. I wanted to touch on a couple of quick things that if you're watching this and, if this is going through your mind, I wanted to touch on this. The first one was, if it feels like all we're doing is taking normal teaching practices and putting the word retrieve in them, that's not exactly, I mean, that's kind of it, but it's like what we're doing is we're taking these standard practices and we're just adjusting them a little bit. So retrieval guides instead of study guides, it's like, yeah, they look like study guides, but they're actually having students pull information out of their brains instead of just mindlessly copying them. So,
right.
So there's that's, I can't remember what my second one was. I'm not retrieving
retrieve it. Yeah.
my thoughts very well on this. I did remember though that I threw out the idea of retrieval guides as something that I wanted you all to talk about. And then I realized that wasn't even the thing that I recorded the podcast episode about. The thing that I recorded the podcast episode about, which is very similar to retrieval guides, is the idea of changing note-taking to retrieval taking. And that's yet another very small shift that I thought was great, because I was just like the student that you just described in the book. I was thinking about back to my college years, where I would be sitting there like furiously taking notes, and it felt like half of my brain was focused on the notes, and the listening was only, I was only listening with half of my brain.
Right.
And that kind of put me at a disadvantage. But being able to shift that just a little bit makes a big difference, right?
Yeah, so I'll give you an example, Matt. So I call it retrieve taking instead of note taking. So in the classroom, it's similar to retrieval guides instead of study guides. Rather than having students take notes, is you give the lesson, they're paying attention, then you pause the lesson, let them retrieve their notes, and then continue. Or when students are studying at home, oftentimes they'll be studying textbook open, just like taking notes during class or taking notes while rereading. A simple switch takes no extra time for students, it'll save them time, is to just read, close the book, retrieve 2 things they just read, and then to open the book and verify, as Patrice said, so that they're not just blindly copying. Even that little 2-second delay, they have to retrieve, what exactly did I just read in the textbook? and then they've got their notes in front of them, but they've retrieved them instead of taking them simultaneously. So one thing I wanted to do, Matt, in our video real quick is I want to encourage all the watchers, all the viewers to do this themselves. So I'd be curious if you could tweet or, you know, share with Matt how often you've been taking notes while you've been watching all the Ditch Summit videos. I want to give you, if you don't mind, like 1 minute, 30 seconds, Matt. We're just going to be silent. And I'd like the viewers to write down 2 things they have learned from Ditch Summit so far.
How about this?
Yeah.
Could we do that, to do that very same thing? If you're watching this video, how about this? Hit pause.
Yes.
Go ahead in just a second and hit pause.
Yeah, there we go.
Call to mind or write down 2 things that you've learned from this video. Ready, set, pause. And now we're back.
Okay. But it's really to emphasize, I just went to a conference and, you know, you have that conference fatigue. There's so much you're cramming in and we need to take time to retrieve it. So I worry that everyone watching this fabulous set of videos is just taking notes while they're watching instead of pausing to retrieve. What are the key points I want to remember from that Ditch Summit video?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's huge. I love that. When it comes to the retrieve taking, like the retrieval based note taking that you were just describing, where you know, the teacher teaches or the student is, you know, absorbing information, but they're not taking notes, and then they stop and they get a second to write down everything that they needed to remember. One of the things that I love about this is that, you know, you do get to give your full attention to listening and paying attention. But B, the thing that I love about it too is that if you pause as the teacher and create an opportunity for some of that metacognition, what you can do is, see, for me, I would have been fearful that I would have forgotten something and that I wouldn't have written something down. And I remember this out of the book. You said that one part of it is that once you're done retrieving, once you're done jotting all of these notes down, you can take a second and talk about the process. What's something that you wrote down, and then talk about the whole process of writing it down and learning and all of that, so that we don't feel like we've missed anything because we're kind of like sharing some of the things we've written down, right?
Yep.
Yeah. So I absolutely love that. I remembered the second thing. Remember, I was saying one of the things was, don't think that we're just throwing the word retrieve on things, and, you know, there's actually a reason for that. So that's one. The other one I wanted to touch on real quick was this. What you're probably hearing from all 3 of us right now is a lot of that traditional classroom mentality. You know, students are reading, students are listening, students are acquiring information. You may even hear the L word. You may even hear that word lecture from us. And I know you get into some education circles. You get out on social media sometimes and people are like, you know, death to lecture, death to all of these things, death to the traditional classroom. The truth is, kids have still got to learn information. You know, in the classroom, we still have to acquire that information somehow. And, you know, as much as we want to try to make engaging classrooms, and you can make engaging classrooms in this way, you know, information still has to be transmitted one way or another. And the strategies that we're talking about fit with that in a variety of different ways. If the teacher is talking, if the students are watching a video, if they're reading something, I mean, through all of those different modalities, kids are acquiring information, and these strategies still fit with that, right?
Yes.
Well, and I'm glad you mentioned that, Matt, because another concern is often that, well, this retrieval is only for basic facts, which it's not. I've done a lot of research in Patrice's classroom, in college classrooms, and there's a lot of research that's been published that these power tools work for basic facts, for learning languages, math, you know, definitions, but these power tools improve complex higher order learning. They improve engineering. They improve how well medical students can diagnose neurology issues. They improve a wide range of information and that long-term learning. The way I think about it is, you know, literally, what's the point if we're doing all of this and then it just flies out of people's heads, right? And so I think something really important about these power tools is that so much research has demonstrated they work for diverse students, diverse ages, diverse content areas. It's not just basic fact learning.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So, and we've touched on, it seems like we've touched on a lot of concrete strategies related to retrieval. Looking back over my notes, I'm seeing retrieve taking instead of note taking, where you listen, then stop, then take your notes. You've got retrieval guides instead of study guides, where you give them kind of a framework to keep everything organized. We talked about brain dumps, where you can just stop every so often and dump what you've learned. We've got the two things, where you get to the end of class and you go, okay, what are the two things that you take away from this? What are the two things you can remember? We've got, we've had a handful of other things as well. Those are the ones I have written down. But I know retrieval is only one of the 4 power tools. And it feels like we've kind of parked on that one for a little bit. So I'm going to give us
for all these other power tools.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So, so now that we have set the firm foundation, let's jump off into some of the other power tools. And, so with our interleaving and our spacing and our feedback-driven metacognition, are you impressed that I just retrieved all of those?
Very much.
Right out of my brain. Patrice, maybe I'll kick this one over to you. Pick another one of those power tools, any one of the 3, and maybe you can show us yet another strategy or another classroom implementation of it.
Let me start with a little story, and that is, this is not a secret. Teaching your students how to learn is a really good thing to do. When students understand retrieval and they understand when you can have a shared language with your students. And so you can say, okay, let's talk about this. I'm spacing this from last quarter. Or when you're able to say, okay, with the mini quizzes, how was your metacognition? Or when we are going over an exam, what types of strategies do you use to help you study? And were you able to gauge your metacognition before you got to the test? So I think one of the things that is so important is not only for educators to get a handle on these power tools, to be able to tweak them, but also to be able to teach your students why. When students learn the why of what you're doing, they will start developing their own strategies based on interleaving, based on spacing. It is really exciting when you start to see how they become empowered with their learning. Yeah. So I wanted to make sure that that got said.
I'm so glad you did. And even with 6th graders, huh?
Oh, absolutely.
Of course.
In fact, can I share a little story?
Yes, please.
So when I would meet with parents during parent-teacher conferences, rather than talking about behavior or specific grades, we spent the whole time talking about learning and strategies that they can use at home, strategies. Well, I had a mom come in and she was a little upset and said, my son does not do well on these mini quizzes. And do you know what I did? I asked him about it. And do you know what he told me? He said, oh, Mom, that's okay. It's just my metacognition telling me I wasn't able to retrieve it yet. And she said, what kind of an answer was that? And I said, oh, the very best.
The brilliant answer.
And so, just being able to teach the kids how to learn, they will then take it and run with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. All right. Yes.
If I could add to exactly what Patrice said, it reminds me that in our book, Powerful Teaching, we kind of think of it as split into thirds. The first third is about the power tools, the strategies, the little bit of research that's applicable to the classroom. The next third is what we call keeping it real and passing the torch. So we have a whole chapter on what does this mean in terms of prep and grading? How can I cover the same amount of content? What do I do in XYZ situation? And then we've got 2 chapters on passing the torch to students and parents, right? They're part of the conversation. How do we get students and parents on board with these small adjustments? And then the third of the book is on professional development. Patrice and I, want to pass the torch to teachers. We want to empower teachers to do their own PD. So in that third part of the book, we've got more than 100 discussion questions already written for you. We've got our own retrieval guide so that you can retrieve throughout the book. We talk about the importance of modeling. We've got a whole sort of lesson plan for how to do this as your own PD in your school. And so it's I think it's important, right? There are other books about how people learn, but we want to make it practical. We want to make it quick. We want to make sure that this gets into the classrooms and students and teachers are on board. So we do spend a lot of time on power tools, but then a lot of like, so now what, right?
Yeah.
Getting beyond that one and done.
Yeah. Okay. So if that's the case, and I'm so glad that you broke it down that way. I think that, I looked at sort of looked through the book, and of course that's the direction that my brain went, but probably in part because I'm so used to, I'm kind of familiar with the power tools. But so now that we've touched on that for a little while, if the rest of it is kind of so now what, I'll kick it back to the both of you, since we're starting to run a little low on time. You've got, if you had an opportunity to pick one of those so now what's that you wanted to tell people about, you got a few minutes for each of you. What's the one that you'd like to share with everyone? And Pooja, why don't you start?
Oh gosh. So now what? Well, I'm trying to think. So now what in terms of the classroom, or so now what in terms of your school, in terms of your district? I'd say to start small. I would encourage you, the viewer, to pause this video again and tweet or write down, of all the strategies we've already talked about, what's one that you want to use. So retrieve it and start thinking about how can you use it tomorrow, or as soon as the semester starts in January, right? So how can you use this one strategy? Pick one, retrieve what it is, and think about, for you, your students best, your curriculum best. What is that one thing, and how can you start exploring how you can just make that small tweak? So I think the so what is really empowering you, the viewer, to think about what is your so now what, right? So I think that would be mine.
That's a really good one. In fact, if we can, maybe we'll encourage you, if you use Twitter, or any sort of social media. I'd say, with the Ditch Summit, we do so much on Twitter on the Ditch Summit hashtag. I might encourage you to take to Twitter and share what that strategy is. If you've listened to this whole video and you've picked maybe one thing that you think you can use, we would love to see it out there on that Ditch Summit hashtag. So please do go ahead and share that. There's also some Twitter handles on this page. We've got the Retrieve Learn Twitter handle. So just at Retrieve Learn, make sure that you get that in there. I'd love to see it on mine also, at JMattMiller, and then of course the Ditch Summit hashtag. If you get a chance to tweet that would be great. Even if you don't do Twitter, that's okay. Just share it with somebody, or just jot it on a Post-it note and stick it up there so that you don't forget it.
Yeah. Well, and I'd encourage anyone to tweet their 2 things, right? So as you're watching videos, tweet your 2 things that you've learned from any of the videos.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, Patrice, it's your turn. If you've got a so now what type of message for everyone, what would it be?
My message is that this is really doable. It's not adding more to your plate. It is, you will spend less time reviewing. You will be empowering your students. And teaching can sometimes be lonely, that you feel overwhelmed, but there's help out there, whether it is on Twitter. If you don't have a neighbor across who's using Powerful Teaching right now, there are people out there. And I wanted to mention that Pooja and I started an online book club last summer, facebook.com/groups/powerful teaching. We have over 850 members from 50 countries around the world.
Wow.
And it is really thrilling to see how people across the world are interacting, the different strategies that they're using. So I want to empower teachers also, that there's a community just waiting for you, whether it's on Twitter, whether it is through your district if they are doing this. I know Pooja and I are going to districts that are adopting powerful teaching. The book club, retrievalpractice.org. There are many avenues to help us all become powerful educators.
Yeah, I love that. Actually, I think that's a great direction for us to go as we wrap this up, is the resources, because I know that the both of you have created tons of free stuff, so generous to put all of this in the hands of teachers so that they can actually use it. We've talked about some of the templates that are available from the book. And I know there's lots of stuff on the retrievalpractice.org website. Pooja, could you give us a quick rundown of what we can find? And by the way, if you're watching this, check out our PDF notes on the Ditch Summit website, and on the speaker page, the links. We're going to have direct access to you for a lot of this stuff.
So on the website, retrievalpractice.org, I send weekly emails. They're meant to be 30 seconds. I don't have much time either, that are usually a little tidbit of research or one of these practical strategies. So you can subscribe for those email updates, again, at retrievalpractice.org. I've got all these free downloads. So I've been writing practice guides that are about not even 10 pages long. They're all written with cognitive scientists, but still focused on practical strategies. They're not full of research mumbo jumbo.
Mm-hmm.
Those are 10 pages. You can download those for free. I've got research on the website as well. You can poke around. There are YouTube videos. And I keep adding new stuff, new links. I've got a list of recommended books on the science of learning. So of course, powerful teaching, but there are a lot more on that website. I've got links to other people like Matt, of course, who are sharing the science of learning. We can't do that on our own. So a lot of it is all there at retrievalpractice.org. And you can follow, as Matt said, you can follow at retrievelearn to keep up to date on Twitter as well. But retrievalpractice.org, I think at this point, has at least 50 free downloads, probably more than that. It keeps growing.
Yeah, and then the book website has lots of the templates from the book too, right?
Yeah, that's powerfulteaching.org. We're also using the hashtag powerfulteaching on Twitter.
Excellent. Oh my goodness, this has been the best. This is exactly what I hoped this would be. Lots of practical strategies, some encouragement, some things you can go get off the web. And if you haven't done so already, what are your 2 things? Yeah. Be thinking about that, from this session and from any of the other sessions that you watch. So Pooja and Patrice, thank you so much for being a part of this video.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
And thank you all for watching.
Yes. Absolutely.
Power up.
Nicely done there, Patrice. And thank you, just like they said, thank you so much for watching this video, for being a part of the Ditch That Textbook Digital Summit. We'll see you on the next video.